It's not bad.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelco. I'm fortunate enough to direct the Environmental Change and Security Program, and on behalf of our president and director, former Congressman Lee Hamilton, it's a tremendous pleasure to host today's discussion with three recidivists plus Ruth in terms of some repeat offenders in terms of coming and talking, and it's wonderful to welcome Ruth Levine to the center for the first time. We're talking about a new report that I think a number of you have seen before, but we're fortunate that we're keen to have it launched here, which is making the case for U.S. international family planning assistance. Notable for a number of reasons, but first and foremost because 5 former directors of USAID's Office of Population, now Office of Population and Reproductive Health, decided to come together and look at the broad situation around family planning assistance in this country, understand it in a larger evidence-based world, but also a political world, a financial world, and we'll hear some expressions of what they've found. It's Steve Sinding, Duff Gillespie, Joe Speidel, Liz McGuire, and Margaret Noyes are 2 directors former directors that the schedule just didn't work for us to get more than 3 at a time, and so they are here in spirit, and we're co-authors on this report as well. And Ruth has kindly agreed to offer some comments in response after Joe and Duff and Steve have presented it. This session, like a number that we've had over, now I think we're in our 13th year or 14th year of support from the USAID Office of Population and Reproductive Health, and as the title of our program suggests, one that tries to bring in some of the connections to these issues, as we'll hear today. When Joe will talk about population-environment connections, Steve will talk about population and poverty connections, ones that bring these different worlds together and understand in an empirical sense, in a policy sense, in a program sense, how these different issues fit together as we see them integrated in the field, and how we have to have that reflected in our institutions and our efforts to address them. As I think many of you know, we're sitting at the formal memorial to Woodrow Wilson. The Center was founded in 1968 by Act of Congress to bring these worlds of scholarship and policy together. And with all these folks kind of going between that world of policy and scholarly endeavors at universities, it's reflected in our people today on the panel, but also what we're trying to do with today's discussion. I hope you will take advantage of, we've been flashing up the various ways that you can take advantage of this knowledge online, in publications, in multimedia formats. We hope you will do that today. We're doing it by live webcasting, so when it comes to time for the discussion, we'll ask you to wait for one of my colleagues to come to you with a microphone, so the folks online, including some AID colleagues who are out of town, who are tuning in to watch today's discussion. And we'll hope you'll find that on the website as well. I'm going to be very brief on introductions because, A, I think these folks are well known to you, but also because you're here to hear from them. Duff Gillespie is a professor at the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health, the Department of Population, Family, and Reproductive Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, which, as somebody who's director of the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, I sympathize with Duff with these long titles. But it's a mark of distinction that so many people want to be affiliated with him, right? Going in alphabetical order, Ruth Levine, as you well know, is an expert on global health and health policy, time in the international financial institutions world, which is, I think, a critical constituency that we need to and are talking with in this context. And then, as you well know, is vice president for programs and operations at the Center for Global Development, one of the really first-rate institutions here in town that are thinking about this in the research side and putting it in the policy context. So it's terrific that Ruth has been able to join us. Steve Sinding, also well known to you now, a senior fellow at Guttmacher Institute. You've known him from his days at International Planned Parenthood Federation, and of course, as I mentioned, former director of Office of Pop at USAID. Also, I should say, a time at Columbia University where we've had him down in that manifestation as well. So it's terrific to have Steve back at the center. And Joe Speidel is professor at University of California, San Francisco, the Bixby Center for Global and Reproductive Health. Someone that is obviously on the clinical side and as a physician, a leader on this, at the Hewlett Foundation on the foundation side, a leader on this, and of course, a former Office of Population, and well, it's probably just Office of Population at the time. Final housekeeping note, we have a reception afterwards, so we hope you can get your copy of the report and have at least 3 of the 5 authors sign it for you and get something to eat. And I think we're going to start off with Steve to go first, and then those panelists, if you'd like to be able to see the slides from the front, then that's certainly help yourself to a seat in the auditorium. Oh, security light, my goodness. There we go. Thanks.
Well, Jeff, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thanks very much to the Woodrow Wilson Center for so graciously hosting what I think is the first formal presentation in Washington of this report. I would like to apologize at the outset to all the women in the audience that despite the fact that the Office of Population over time achieved something approaching gender equity, we haven't done very well in achieving that in this afternoon's presentation, but I assure you it's entirely coincidental. Liz very much wanted to be here, but couldn't be, and the same with Margaret. I'd also like to assure you that the fact that the 3 of us males are here presenting today does not in any way reflect our relative contributions to the report. As anybody who knows Liz and Margaret could certainly imagine, their fingerprints and thumbprints are all over this report, and it would have been much poorer if it hadn't been the product of all 5 of us. It's really good to be here. I think if the term preaching to the choir ever had meaning, it has meaning in this context, because I see so many friends who I know agree with us and believe in what this report says. But thank you very much for coming, and please give copies of the report to all your friends and enemies. Duff is going to be presenting the paper itself, which is primarily about how U.S. aid could productively and effectively use significantly more resources if they were available. And he will also talk about the political barriers to achieving that. As Jeff mentioned, Joe and I are going to be talking more about the why. The report is about the what. And it doesn't go into a lot of detail about why this issue remains important, why family planning still ought to be a high priority in U.S. development assistance and development cooperation. And so in today's presentation, each of us is going to spend a little bit of time talking about the why question. In Joe's case, the environmental why. In my case, the economic why. And in that sense, I regard myself as something of an imposter because, as Ruth would be the first to tell you, I'm not an expert nor a contributor to the very considerable literature on economic demographic relationships, but I have been a long-time student of that work, have followed it intently, even bear some responsibility for the production of some of the research, including the infamous, to some, famous to others, 1986 National Academy report, which introduced officially the era, which I'll talk about a little bit more, of what Alan Kelly called what did he call it? I'm blocking. Revisionist thinking about the relationship. But let me proceed. The debate about the relationship between economic development and fertility or demography really takes 2 forms. At one level, it takes the form of the question, does the number of children that a family has affect the well-being of that family and its prospects for the future? At the macro level, the same version of that debate has to do with the relationship between rapid population growth at the societal level and the prospects for economic development or economic performance. But the obverse of the debate is the other direction, which is, does income level or poverty status affect fertility outcomes at the family level? And at the macro level, does the performance of an economy affect fertility of the society as a whole? I think that over the years, a fairly broad consensus has emerged that rising prosperity, whether at the family level or at the national level, does lead to declining fertility and reducing population growth. So I'm not really going to talk about that. My focus is going to be on the still much more contentious question of whether reduced fertility improves the economic prospects of societies and families. So let's start with the macro level and what we know at the macro level. The debate goes back to Thomas Malthus, you all know that, and revolves around two questions that divided the Malthusians and the Marxians over two centuries or more. Should we reduce population growth in order to avoid a whole variety of calamities, including economic stagnation? And the other side of that debate, which is the Marxian response, which is, should we address poverty and inequality, as a result of which population growth will fall naturally? And the great debate in development economics, really for 2 centuries, has revolved around those 2 points of view. There have been really 3 stages in the modern era of thinking about this. In the immediate post-World War II period, when the reality of explosive population growth in the developing world first was recognized by demographers at the UN, the initial response on the part of the development community generally and the international community generally was a Malthusian or neo-Malthusian response, exemplified in the work of Ansley Cole and Edwin Hoover, but also seen in the work of Gunnar Myrdal in his Asian drama, in the work of Stephen Enke and others, basically saying that rapid population growth significantly reduces the prospects for economic development and economic improvement, and that the way to address the issue is largely through family planning and other measures to reduce rapid population growth. In 1972, the National Academy of Sciences produced a report which strongly underscored and reinforced that conclusion. Then, development economics, in examining the empirical relationship between high fertility and economic outcomes, discovered in many analyses that the relationship was a very weak one and a very difficult one to discern, that in fact the economic performance of countries appeared to vary independently of their demographic change, and that it was very hard to argue on the basis of observing the performance of countries through the 60s and into the 70s that reducing fertility had very much benefit from an economic development standpoint. That became the revisionist view, as Alan Kelly characterized it, and it was sanctified by the 1986 National Academy report, which essentially said that population approaches being a neutral factor. At very high levels, it certainly can have a negative effect, but it is hardly determinative. Julian Simon certainly was the best-known leader of the revisionist view, in fact taking the contrary view, not only that it was not neutral, but that in fact population growth was a positive factor for development. So where are we today? Where we are today, I think, and will argue, is at Revisionism Revised. And this has come about largely as the consequence of a new body of research which revolves around the concept of the demographic bonus, or the demographic window of opportunity. This is work that largely has been centered at Harvard, but also at the University of Hawaii and a couple of other centers, most closely associated with David Bloom and David Canning, who have looked very carefully at a number of national cases, most particularly the Asian tigers and the once Celtic tiger, or Celtic tiger. And they argue, as I think most of you are aware, that if you look at age structure, you can discern a very real effect of demographic change on economic performance and economic outcomes. If you look just at economic performance and demographic change without looking at what lies beneath the surface, yes, you'll get wishy-washy results. But if you look at what happens to the age structure of a population, it really does make a difference. And to make a very long story short, what they argue and what they show in their research is that countries which manage to reduce fertility, particularly if they do so relatively rapidly, create a period during which the working age population is quite large in comparison with the dependent population, both at the young and at the old end of the age spectrum. That unique moment in a country's demographic history represents an important window of opportunity. They don't argue that it automatically translates into improvements in economic performance, but they do argue that it creates the opportunity that did not exist at a period of high fertility and will not exist during a period of high old age dependency, to pursue a set of economic policies which can result in very rapid economic growth. And that, they argue, is what happened in the case of the Asian tigers, who did it quite explicitly. Out of that has emerged a new kind of, I would say, emerging consensus in development economics that demography can make a very significant difference in economic outcomes, although it is not a sufficient condition for that to happen. And in fact, in looking at the performance of countries over time, they would argue that many of the countries of Latin America which created the window of opportunity failed to cash in on it over the last 2 decades or so, that the African countries haven't yet reached the point where one can look at that question. And the rest of the world, apart from East Asia, is sort of varies between success stories and lack of success, depending upon the economic policies that they pursued at the same time. As I say, this is not by any means a consensus, but it's an emerging one. Let me try to go more rapidly. At the micro level, we actually know less, in part because data are fewer, further between, harder to collect, and far more expensive to collect. But there are now sufficient bodies of longitudinal household information which have enabled economic demographers or development economists to look at the relationship over time between fertility at the family level and what happens to the prospects of those families. The study that I think is most persuasive and to me the most dramatic is one that Paul Schultz and Joshi, a student of his, at Yale carried out on MATLAB data, the famous MATLAB experiment, in which Schultz, who was a long-time skeptic about the demographic-economic relationship, found and concluded that, in fact, families which reduce their fertility have done significantly better over a 15 to 20 year period than families that didn't. And that in this microanalysis, it becomes clear for the first time that there is a relationship that looks causal. But the direction of causality is still something of a debate. I I think that the data on parental intentions with respect to fertility helps us to understand the direction of causality. The finding over time, year after year, in country after country, of the level of unmet need and the level of unintended pregnancies suggests that a great many families, given the opportunity to reduce their fertility, would do so, and suggests that they at least understand that if they were able to reduce their fertility, this might quite significantly increase the opportunities for themselves, but most particularly for their children. So, I think Nancy Birdsall, who has studied this question as long as anybody, and with, I think, as objective an eye as anybody I know, says in the volume that she and Alan Kelly and I co-edited back in the around 2000, called Population Matters, which I think probably many of you have seen, says that high fertility exacerbates poverty, or better put, makes poverty reduction more difficult and less likely. And I think that's a conclusion with which most economists who have looked most carefully at this question would today agree. So let's look just at a few trends and prospects. One of the things that's very interesting is that poverty levels around the world have declined and have been declining steadily since 1980. If you look at these curves, on the left-hand side, the right-hand side is just the same countries excluding China, but on the left-hand side, these are just different poverty levels, whether one defines it in terms of $1 a day up to $2 a day. The trends are quite clear. These are World Bank data, by the way. What's equally interesting to me is that in every region except sub-Saharan Africa, there has been some decline. I should say Eastern Europe and Central Asia also is something of an exception, but as you can see, the levels are extremely low. There has been a decline in the percentage of people living on less than $1 a day. But what really is striking is that if you take Asia out of the equation, the relationship looks very different. That black line called the world would look almost flat. It would look, in fact, like Latin America, which is the line just a bit below it. World Bank economists have, for the most part, internalized the lessons of the East Asian miracle, and they now incorporate them in the policy advice they give to governments, with the exception of the question of policies to reduce high fertility and rapid population growth. And it seems to me that the challenge that lies before us is somehow to break through the institutional or professional skepticism that continues to exist in the World Bank about these findings in this relationship. There is no institution that is more influential with ministers of finance and heads of state around the world than the World Bank. And if the bank were to persuade ministers of finance that reducing fertility is an important component of an economic growth and development strategy, I think it would make a very big difference in the future allocation of resources to family planning programs. I can't end without saying a word about Africa. It's far from a hopeless case in my view. We've seen the success stories in South Africa, in Botswana, in Zimbabwe at a period in its history, Kenya at a period in its history, Rwanda more recently, the experimental case of Nevrongo, which essentially reinforces the findings of Matlab from 20 years earlier. The African successes have, in every case except the Nevrongo experiment, been accompanied by very strong political commitment. And this brings me back to the World Bank story. If governments commit themselves to fertility reduction policies, they can be successful. In the absence of political commitment and the allocation of resources, these policies are not likely, particularly in extremely low income settings, to be successful. Political leaders in far too many African states are not being advised to address population as a development issue, and this needs to change. I'm not going to get into the debate here about what those policies should look like, except to say that obviously they should not be coercive, if there's one thing we have learned over the last 20 years, it is that by addressing the unsatisfied demand through voluntary programs, we can achieve these population outcomes without coercion or pressure or other forms of policy beyond family planning. So I'm not advocating policies that would in any way diminish the autonomy or the power of women. I'm not going to go through these conclusions because I don't think I need to. You know where I stand, and in the interest of time, let me end here and turn it over to Joe.
Well, it's nice to join so many friends once again here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And thanks, Jeff, for queuing up my presentation. Being one of the academic Amish, I'm not too good at manipulating this thing. Today I'm going to talk about humanity's overexploitation of natural resources and the degradation of life-supporting ecosystems, and of course the link to population size and population growth. And at the end, I'm going to not spend a lot of time on it, but suggest some of the solutions that do exist that we could implement and really haven't yet. The UN sponsored a major study, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, that was published in 2005. And unfortunately, this got very little attention. But they did conclude that environmental damage in the last 50 years has become much more severe and much more extensive, primarily to meet increasing demands for food, freshwater, timber, fiber, fuel, and other resources. One of these resources is forest resources. Since pre-agricultural times, we've lost about 50% of forest resources, and about 22% of this total loss has occurred in the 20th century. Currently, about 1/3 of the Amazon rainforest is already gone. I'm sorry, 1/4 of the Amazon rainforest is gone, and perhaps 1/3 of forested areas in Africa have been lost. One thing that the resource shortfalls translate into is food insecurity. And as you can see from this slide, there were pushing 1 billion people who are chronically hungry in 2007. Worldwide, it's about 17% of people, but in 15 countries in Africa, this reaches 35%. And most alarming is that 1 in 3 children younger than 5 in developing countries suffer from either physical or mental stunting or both. A very large number of these are occurring in India, which is a country economically on the rise, but this obviously hasn't translated into food security for many people living in India. Well, I'm going to go through some of the ecosystems that relate to food security. Certainly one is fisheries. And currently about 75% of global fisheries are either at their biologically sustainable limit or overfished, and some have totally collapsed. Wild fish are the access to wild fish is certainly on the decline, but fish farming has replaced a lot of fish production. Croplands are shrinking due to soil erosion and desertification. And it's estimated that 10% of the Earth's surface has already been changed from forest or rangeland into desert. I recall once on a trip into Tunisia, I went out into the desert and saw a wonderful Roman stadium and thought, why did they build this here in the desert? And only later did it dawn on me, this was Rome's granary, but it's now a desert. It's estimated that the productive capacity of 25% of agricultural lands, and that is an area equal in size to India and China combined, has been degraded. And, of course, our use of products from croplands, such as converting corn to ethanol, drives up the price of grain, limits amounts available for export and the amounts for human consumption, worsening food security. Water shortage is a growing problem, and there are various ways to measure water shortages, but it's estimated that by 2025, 3/4 of people will face some degree of water scarcity. One of the most serious issues is depletion of aquifers, and some 300 million people living in India and China are at threat by loss of water from aquifers. Melting glaciers in places like India, China, and South Africa threaten irrigation during growing seasons, as does snowmelt in various countries, Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Western United States. One estimate is that in my home state, California, that we're going to lose 90% of the snowpack in another 100 years. This is a very significant issue because half of the about half of the nuts and fresh vegetables for America come out of California, and if there's no runoff in the summertime, irrigation will collapse in that state. By the way, California is the top agricultural state with about twice the agricultural productivity of number 2 Texas or number 3 Iowa. So this is very important. Another threat to food security is climate change, and it's suggested that past record temperatures may become the norm by 2100. I've listed some changes that every degree of increase in norm will do to crop yield. We had a precedent of this in the 2003 heat wave that hit Europe. Some 50,000 people died from heat stress, but also in France, the corn and fruit crop declined by 25%. The corn crop in Italy declined by 35%. So just rapidly rising temperatures threatens crop yields, as well as drying water that's needed to grow crops. Now this graph shows carbon dioxide emissions per capita, which haven't changed very much. In fact, they've just edged up a little bit. And the clear lesson from these two charts is more people means more carbon dioxide, which is a major greenhouse gas. Now here I've laid out the sources of greenhouse gases, and the one that really surprised me was that second one on the list, livestock production. So that's mainly production of beef, pork, chickens, and so forth. And that makes up 18% of greenhouse gases, and surprisingly it's more than transportation, more than driving your car. So I guess the answer to this is we should all become vegetarians. When we go to McDonald's, don't buy the Big Mac, get the salad. But certainly that is something that can be done with regard to lifestyle. Now let's turn a little bit more to the impact of humans on the environment. It relates to their size, it relates to their consumption per capita, and it relates to the environmental impact of the technology that's used to produce whatever is consumed. And there's certainly room for improvement with regard to all three of these issues. I've laid out a little demographic data here. There is some good news. Obviously, since 1950, when the world had 2.6 billion people, the birth rate was much higher. But the annual increment of growth was not nearly what it is today, which is about 78 or 79 million, even though the birth rates have come down substantially. And I put the U.S. data on there just to show that the U.S. also is growing quite rapidly. Of course, our growth has a lot to do with immigration and the fertility of immigrants. these are the familiar charts that you've seen that show the various variant, low, high, and medium that the UN projects. Certainly, I think we would be advised to do everything we can to help the world traverse the low variant, but that doesn't seem to be happening. Although just 2 weeks ago, the UN released new demographic projections, and there was a little bit of good news in that. Excuse me, the old projection said that if we had constant fertility, that is to say, no change, no decline in birth rates, because all of these projections, even the high, suggest fairly substantial decline in birth rates. Anyway, if we had no change, that we would peak out at 11.9 billion. That was the old projection. The new projection is 11 billion, which suggests that maybe we aren't doing so badly. Anyway, here's some population growth figures for various regions. I think the most amazing one on here is Africa, growing by 100%, adding 1 billion people, and I question whether really that's going to happen. In fact, let me just grab this one number that I wrote down for Nigeria. Okay, Nigeria is currently at 148 million people. The projection is that Nigeria would be 282 million people in 2050. So Nigeria is a country about the size of Texas. Somehow I can't imagine all 300 million Americans living in Texas for various reasons. But I just don't think that's going to happen. And if it does, I think the human condition is not going to be in great shape. I put the U.S. on this table because it shows that the U.S. is actually growing pretty rapidly, just about as fast as the rest of the world. And of course, once again, that isn't because of our birth rate. Now, here's another aspect of growth that I'm sure doesn't get much attention, but in Africa, there's been a livestock explosion along with the population explosion of people. And we've already noted that livestock are a huge contributor to greenhouse gases, but also are not friendly to the environment in terms of other ways, especially in the Sahel. Here's another slide that relates to food security. Certainly the area of cropland has dropped very dramatically over time. And even if we reach that UN median projection, there will be even less cropland. Of course, this varies dramatically between countries. Some countries are well off, others are not. Now, I'd like to turn to family planning. And as Steve mentioned, certainly one place we can all agree on is working to reduce unintended pregnancies. As you can see, both in the U.S. and around the world, just about half of the births are unplanned. And if we could get rid of unintended pregnancies, we could make a big dent in growth rates. One of the crucial problems we're not doing better is because of lack of financial resources. Of course, we need trained personnel, we need contraceptives, we need many other things, but money can help buy all of those things, and the money is missing. There are many different estimates of how much money is actually needed to run family planning programs. I've looked at about 4 or 5 different estimates, but a reasonable round number for family planning plus a good delivery system is about $15 billion a year. The Cairo conference suggested that 1/3 of the funds should come from donors, which would be $5 billion a year. We could argue that maybe a higher percentage should come from donors. Right now, the UN AIDS asks for 2/3 of donors' funds go to address AIDS. But as you can see from this chart, almost all population resources, or 80% of population resources, are likely to go into HIV/AIDS, and that family planning and reproductive health get much less. It's Certainly of the $5 billion that's needed from donors every year, less than 20% is available. Now let me turn to perhaps some solutions to the dilemma we seem to be in. I think the main thing we need to do is move from a fossil fuel-based petroleum economy into an electric economy powered mainly by wind, photovoltaic, and other renewable resources, such as hydro, geothermal, and biomass. Some people have suggested we need to go nuclear, but others say, well, nuclear power is just a starter kit for nuclear weapons. We shouldn't go there, and it's way too expensive. Certainly, we need to improve public transportation. We need to raise the energy efficiency of appliances, and certainly heating of homes and buildings can be changed. In fact, there are good models of buildings that essentially require no outside energy resources. I've been to the Aspen Institute, and they have a home where they say the electric bill is like $5 a year, and this is in the Rocky Mountains, but they are able to do it through technology. And my final comment on this slide, we should minimize the consumption of meat. Here's some possible futures of a new economic system that can restore natural systems. We need to replant forests and limit their use. Forests have been replanted in South Korea, in Japan, and also forests are regrowing in North America and Russia. We can conserve and rebuild soils. We can restore fisheries. I think establishing these huge marine reserves, which are no-go for fishing areas, could make a huge contribution. And we need to preserve water resources. I think the implications of continuing population growth for the environment are very serious, and the projected growth of possibly to 9.8 billion people, unless we strengthen family planning programs, is of serious concern. We also need to reform our economic systems. If not, we're in big trouble. One thing that I think is favorable in all of this is that we know how to do family planning, we know what it costs, we know that it works, and we do already have much of the knowledge and technology to help preserve the environment, but we are certainly having a shortfall of political will, lifestyle choices, and financial resources. Thank you.
Duff? Yeah. It's showtime.
To avoid confusion later on, I should mention that Margaret Noisa is hoping to make the reception, so she's not boycotting this presentation due to the testosterone count on the podium. Let me preface by indicating that everybody in this room, I suspect, knows that ideology usually trumps evidence. And so what I'm going to talk about today is what is the evidence that we presented in the report, but also talk about some things that aren't in the report about some of the challenges we have, many of those challenges that people in this room daytime job is actually trying to meet those challenges. So in the question and answers, I'm sure we'll benefit from some of the questions and observations with people that are the real advocates in this area. And lastly, just to say what a pleasant experience it is to see a lot of the familiar faces, and I do look forward to talking with all of you later on. Okay, very briefly, and some of you have actually probably had a chance to read the report, and others of you have heard presentations by me or some of the other former directors. So I'm going to go through a lot of this pretty fast to get to sort of the new part. It is evidence-based effort. we focused on a very narrow area, increasing funds for USAID's family planning program. That was our comparative advantage, knowing USAID's program. Very importantly, we don't see this as a standalone advocacy effort. It's very much seen as part of a larger effort that, again, many of you are heavily involved in, and it's funded by the Packard and the Gates Foundations. Those have been mentioned. The Fab Five, we refer to ourselves in private conversations. And during the writing of this report, we refer to each other in private to other things too, but well, consensus was always not that easy to get to. But actually, there's a surprising amount of little acrimony. A lot of you were actually consulted about this effort before it took place, and those consultations really led to the second bullet here. Don't try to do something that we're already involved in. Play to your strength. Do something that gives whatever you're trying to say a little bit more gravitas than it otherwise have. So that's really the reasons why we said, okay, we're going to really just talk about USAID. And also, this is probably, I guess, the one area, Steve and Joe would probably agree with this, the one area which there was probably some disagreement on what not to include in the report. And as you can see, some of the things that we all feel very strongly about personally, the global gag rule and various other women empowerment issues, is not in the report, and that was a very difficult decision to arrive at. But when you're trying to maximize the number of people that you're trying to get support for funds for, you don't want to go out of your way to cause some alienation. We also saw very much as building upon the billion-dollar ask that two well-known senators, then senators, signed on to. There were 18 senators and 52 or 56 House members. And the reason I took this, not in anticipation of Joe's comments, but the letter, which a couple of people in this room had a hand in drafting, is actually a very concise, well-written summary of why you should be investing in this area. And it goes well beyond just the empowerment of women and to decide the number of people, a number of children they could have. So it's actually, if you haven't read it, I would suggest that you do read it, and you can get off the Pop Connection or PAI's website. So what's the takeoff point? The takeoff point was this: USAID's budget, and you can see that we have in constant dollars basically been rather stagnant, and most recently in current dollars, also stagnation has stepped in. So that was what we were concerned about mostly. This is a very simple diagram showing what our strategy is. This highlights that we see making the case going through these, and this is probably the most important of those elements, the current very active advocacy community in Washington and elsewhere. This is our principal audience, but we're also working with some of the other donors, especially the UK, UNFPA, WHO, and some other organizations. But the main focus, it's very much within the Beltway type of strategy. I'll skip this. Okay, so this is in the report, so I'm going to go through it very quickly. The first thing we try to establish, building on some of the comments that Steve made, is that we're talking about an unmet need. So that what's in the report is basically saying there's an existing demand, while at some point demand creation is going to be important. Right now, the thing that USAID's program could do, they know how to do it and do it very well, is to develop programs to meet unmet need for family planning. We highlighted, and we'll get back to this, Africa because while the numbers are huge in South Asia, here is where the problem really for the next decades is going to be in development in general and in population specifically. And I think one of the things that we frequently characterize Africa as Africa, and obviously Africa is a very complex continent with many variations to it, but that there is unmet need, very high unmet need, and a number of very important critical countries in Africa. So even in Africa, where there is a high desired fertility, there is also a very high unmet need. That chances have shown, and programs have shown, that if you can make good quality voluntary services available, they will in fact be used. The other thing that we are concentrating on, perhaps more than we would have, say, 10 years ago, is family planning as an investment. Just as a footnote, almost everything we have in the report is actually drawn from research that was supported by USAID. And we all took a great deal of actual pride, not that we were involved personally in it, but to be associated with an organization that basically has accounted for the evidence base, not just for the United States, but for the world in this area. And one of the studies that they did was to look at 29 different countries and looked at what an unmet need, investing in family planning, and if you fulfill the unmet need, what would be the return on investment in a variety of MDGs. And you can see it's about a 1 to 4 or so ratio that holds up, varies from one country to another. But it basically shows that this is a very good investment for development, not just for areas of health. The other area that is an example of USAID's strength is the importance of having a contraceptive mix and high quality of services. And there's not as much research on this as I thought there would be, and we looked for more evidence, but this is pretty convincing. And based on experience that many of us have had overseas, we know this is the case, that when you add new contraceptives or improve your contraceptive mix and make it more accessible, you do have an additive impact on the number of use because you're addressing your services to a wider variety of needs found in your catchment population. So we're talking about increasing services, but also increasing the quality and the method mix of services. So we put all this together, and unlike some of the other estimates made, we started working with the 52 countries that USAID was in at that time, made a number of assumptions which are described in the appendix, drew on the work of other people, and it seems like all things have to do with cost estimates or cost analysis somehow or another go back to John Stover, and indeed we picked his brain. And there's still a lot left over for those of you who continue to want to pick his brain. And then we made some decisions on how the funds should be allocated. And we did that based primarily on where is USAID allocating its funds now. And so as a result, you have Africa getting, in terms of its population size, a disproportionate amount of its resources because of the calculus that USAID is using. And indeed, this would be even more dramatic if you were to knock out Afghanistan, which receives the largest amount of family planning, if I'm correct on that, Scott, of any other country. Go figure why. I mean, I can't figure it out. Then we came up with a figure for UNFPA of $60 million, which was in the billion-dollar ask letter, and felt that that was kind of reasonable to do. And then basically turned to Steve and said, well, as a former head of IPPF, what do you think? And we discussed that aloud, and that was 13. So basically, the 62 million and the 13 were not based on any assessment of programs or activities, but based on a consideration that two things are very important, not only symbolically, but otherwise. One is a strong IPPF. And this is for London. There'd be, I think, considerably more money that will go into their affiliates now that the global gag rule is no longer with us. So this is just the central office. And that the same were UNFPA, that despite concerns that many of us have about UNFPA, it's absolutely critical that we have a strong UN organization to not only provide services and information, but because of the podium in which both those organizations afford. Okay, so this is a slightly different version and something that many of you have seen. And I'm just going to quickly go over this because it is a cautionary tale that we have to keep in mind. Many of you remember the exciting days of the first few years of the Clinton administration, the anticipation that at last we turned the corner. For the first time in a long time, you had the Democrats controlling the White House and the both chambers of Congress. And indeed, you had bite my tongue, you had Cairo, and you saw a dramatic increase in funds. And then something began to happen. This is the appropriations, this is the request. And what happened, you kind of expect maybe the appropriations to go down a bit because Congress was regained by the Republicans. But you wouldn't anticipate the request level from, in this case, the Clinton administration to go down. And since much of that happened under my watch, I can tell you that we tried our best. But without a champion that was present during the first couple of years, Tim Wirth, we basically went down in defeat in terms of requesting levels. USAID's leadership never promoted family planning. There was a constant battle within that. Brian Atwood, and if he were here today, I would say it to his face, because I have said it to his face, never believed in family planning. The only reason he tolerated it was because it was a pro-choice administration. The leadership, once Tim left to the State Department, was basically indifferent. So what saved the day was actually bipartisan support on the Hill. So we were at least able to find a sort of a stable figure that, due to the work of people like Craig here, were able to keep the figures at least up there. But then look what happened. Surprise, surprise, George W. Bush gets elected and the budget goes up and the request level goes up. What in the world is going on here? And what you have here is the influence of people in this room, people within the agency, people within the State Department, but most importantly, Colin Powell, who basically said, we're going to keep this level up. He left after the first term and it went back down again. An area that Condi Rice is not at all interested in. And you begin to see the increase of funding, which now will be up here someplace. It's not shown on this. So what's the cautionary tale there? And it's a very important cautionary tale. A change in leadership at the highest level does not automatically translate into a budgetary and programmatic reality. And indeed, people who may not be that well known outside of the government. Tim Wirth is known very much for all of us and people in Colorado, probably many of them still, but outside of that area of within the Beltway, he's not that well known. But he personally was responsible for getting this spike that took place. We don't know who those people are going to be in the new administration at that level. But they will be important, and once we are identified by who they are, we need to get information to them and to cultivate that position. Because I think that without support at that level, and with so much competition for scarce resources for other good things, It's not like this is the only issue that deserves more funding. And we could go quickly down a list and come up with lots of worthy areas that have been underfunded for the last 8 years or so, are totally neglected. Now, so we got the evidence, and let's see what's going to happen. So I kind of went through, and this isn't everything that's happened, but you can see it's kind of mixed, starting off with Rick Warren being, and that means negative. I still can't figure that one out, and I don't want to talk about it too much because it makes me so mad. But he did it, and I was pleased that Warren gave a horrible invocation, but it was not a good harbinger of things to, possibly not a good harbinger of things to come. The next two, it would have been a shock if he didn't do this. There was, as many of you know, a debate when he would do it, but very little doubt that he did. When he, by the way, is President Obama. But he did, and I thought his statement on UNFPA was particularly strong and welcome. I put this as a plus or minus. It was just sort of a blip, and that unless you got PAI's newsletters, you probably wouldn't even noticed it. That the day after, or several days after, the Mexico City policy was rescinded, there was a bill on the Senate to, in effect, make the Mexico City policy a law, which was defeated soundly, but still got, I think it was 33 votes. I think I got all the not all the Republicans. I think I got 33 votes or 36 votes. And the reason I put it up there is that many people think that the ideological battles or cultural wars are going into the background. I don't think they are. I think they're very much alive. And one of the big disappointments was when the president asked the leadership in the House to take out a rather innocuous language that would make it easier for poor women to access family planning services under Medicaid. It basically just made it easy to expand the eligibility criteria. And he did that for reasons I obviously don't know, but the idea behind it seems to have been this effort to have a broad bipartisan effort on the stimulus package. Well, that failed miserably because he isn't getting that, and indeed didn't get any votes for this particular package on the House Republican side. On the plus side, something that Representative Crawley did from New York got a discount pricing for clinics at universities and Planned Parenthood facilities. These two are both on domestic. There's some other examples which I won't go into. Talk about one later. But the point is that it's not all pluses, green pluses. There's lots of mixes in here. Even though the Democrats and the pro-choice people have clear majorities in both houses. So we got the increase. I should explain this. So we got an increase of $80 million or so in the International Family Planning budget. A lot of people were pleased by that. Some people were ecstatic by that. I'm happy about that, but I'm not ecstatic. Here's one of the reasons, besides it being a relatively small amount of money. If you look at where the money's coming from, this is basically money from the child health, child survival. That should be a G. Global health, child survival. And so that's the money that what most people typically think of as foreign assistance money for health. That's the money that USAID has a fairly high degree of control on where it will be spent and what it should be spent on after you get through with congressional earmarks. Then you go to ESF. That's the money that goes to, among other places, Egypt. And that pretty much says the money's going to go to those countries. Whether they need it for family planning or don't need it, it's going to go to those countries. This is Department of State, and that's for UNFPA. This is for, what is that? That's UNFPA. No, this is UNFPA. This is UNFPA. This is UNFPA, and this is Europe and Eurasia. So these two combined are UNFPA. And the reason why this is that it's coming from this. But there's an earmark on Congress saying that goes to UNFPA. So basically, this is what there's some discretionary control over in terms of how USAID will use the money and where we use it. And that makes it the increase over the 435 level actually relatively modest. And rather than an 18% increase, it makes it about 9 or 10%. Now, so basically, this is not enough money to get the job done. Now, one of the things that happened that I didn't put up on the list of the pluses and minuses, because it's a little bit out of it, but it's, again, in one of these cautionary tales, and that is there's an authorization bill on maternal health which doesn't have any family planning in it, even though one of the sponsors of it is a champion of family planning. The reason I put this up is that this was, and there's at least one person that was at the meeting in this room who may want to embellish this some if I don't have it right. I wasn't at the meeting. But this was a Gallup poll that was done very recently, and it went through those actions that the president had taken and asked people, what do you think about that? Were favorable or not favorable? And at the bottom, if you can see it, is allow funding for overseas family planning groups that provide abortions. A very inaccurate description of the Mexico City policy, but it got a relatively low 35% versus up in the 70s. Now, the reason I mention this is that it does suggest we got some communication problems with the general public, but it also suggests that even those individuals who are strong advocates for family planning still kind of figure it's a toxic issue. So that if you're trying to promote something in another area, maternal health, it's best to keep it clean of lightning rods which will strike as a result of opponents to family planning. I'm actually not sure that analysis is wrong, but what is wrong is that it means our work is really cut out for us, because if our champions are adopting that position, think of what those that are indifferent are hostile. So we have some work cut out. Now, U.S. leadership is more than the U.S. government. But I do think that the economic crisis is actually going to make USAID's program even more important, and the need for the Department of State, especially with Secretary Clinton, whoever the new aid administrator is, the career people such as Scott, really need to establish, again, the importance of population for economic development purposes, for health purposes, for rights purposes. Now, one of the reasons I think it is because the foundations have been relatively hit relatively hard. Packard and Hewlett both are cutting back on their programs, and those two organizations have been, after Rockefeller and Ford left the field basically some years ago, those have been two foundations which have been pretty generous, but also visible in their support for not just family planning, but also abortion. And their visibility was not only through some of the people that were involved with the program, but also by those organizations that they supported who are quite vocal. And in fact, Joe Speidel is pretty much responsible for a lot of the advocacy work that's now going on in Europe by making some investments a number of years ago when he was at Hewlett to help them mobilize a commitment to international family planning in Europe. The Susie Buffett Foundation is quite generous, but also very quiet, and the other use of the term, and prefers to be called the anonymous donor. And while they have been cut rather much by the downturn, they still be a major player, and I'm not quite sure what their budget plan is, but I think it's going to be still around 300 or so million, hopefully in that ballpark a year. While Hewlett is probably in the 50 area, and Packard's going to be in the low 30s or maybe even lower. So that leaves us with, the foundation. And the annual letter that he wrote, which is a very interesting letter, which you can get on your webpage if you haven't seen it yet, covers reproductive health, although it doesn't talk about that per se. It's under something called child survival, I think, or child health. It's pages 4 to 6, and I probably could recite it for you word by word, but instead of that, I'll show you this one part here, and you can just read it yourself. But basically, Bill said that he and Melinda had sort of an epiphany and realized that while they started off with a very high emphasis on reproductive health, they realized that if they could reduce infant and child mortality, that the desired family size would plummet and family planning wouldn't be that important. Words to that effect. And of course, the child survival hypothesis is real, and it's not that's not an important thing to do to save children. Do it for lots of reasons, including that it does depress a desired number of children. But it's not the only reason, and some would say it's not even the most important reason. I'm not making this up. As I was going over my slides, I got something on my BlackBerry, which was in response to a letter that some of us sent, 13 people sent to Bill Gates, respectfully, very respectfully in my case, since it pays my salary and everything else, humbly pointing out that he didn't get quite it right, and that we were concerned. So why are we concerned? Not just because he didn't get it right. Think of the impact Bill Gates has had in international health. So it's not that they're ignoring this area. In fact, I'll go give a couple of figures later on. It's that the opportunity missed to have him take on this as he has for childhood immunization, for malaria, for HIV/AIDS, for vaccine development, it would be huge. And one of the things I fantasize about, and I guess my social life has gone to hell, is having Hillary Clinton, Bill Gates, some other national leaders on the podium someplace saying we feel this is a critical development issue. So the disappointment isn't so much that he's not doing anything in this area, it's just he could do so much more. Well, how much more could he do? Well, the strategy, which some of you have seen, calls for around $600 million over 5 years, say $120 million a year. Last year, their grant giving was $2.8 billion. So even their stated plan, compared to the wealth that they bring to the table, is it's important, and it's more than the foundations, the three foundations I mentioned combined. But it's so much, would be so much more powerful if there was some bumping up of funds, but more importantly, that when he goes to Davos or when he goes to New York or when he sees the president, that he says a few words about this. So hopefully there'll be a dialogue between the authors of those letters and for you to encourage Bill and Melinda to be more proactive in this area. And I think if we can do that, we will have earned our keep. This is just the acknowledgments, and the research support, besides the 5 former directors, was very much helped by these graduate students and my colleague Sabrina Clarkland. So thank you very much. You want a slide?
I don't have any slides. Yeah, get rid of that.
I know.
Only
I
slides.
know. You can't. They're such great slides. You know.
Okay. Oh, that's good. You can leave that.
Leave that peaceful. It's not going to put people to sleep.
Oh, that's distracting. Okay. I'm going to get rid of that box. Well, thanks. I'm only going to take a few minutes because so much has already been said. I certainly agree with one of Duff's comments about how the battle is not in any way won simply because there's a friendlier administration and Congress in town, and there are battle lines drawn all over the place. I just saw, about an hour before I came over here, I saw some comments that the Pope made during his trip to, is making during his trip to Africa, where he talked about how the distribution of condoms is actually making the AIDS problem in Africa worse, and that that he bemoaned the fact that Africa has, and this is in quotes, a contraception culture. So,
If only.
We wish.
He's never right, is he?
Oh my goodness! And this is being webcast stuff. So, all right. So I'm just going to make a few reflections from the perspective of somebody who's not inside of USAID, but rather outside and looking at a whole host of development and health and gender-related issues, depending on the hour of the day. So I'll make a few reflections, and then I have 2 recommendations for areas to, or ideas to work on. So these reflections are really mostly around Steve's presentation, where he talked really very clearly about how complicated the relationship, understanding the relationship is between income poverty in the household, macroeconomic national income growth, and fertility. And that's certainly true. And, you know, anytime you have a sort of research question that traces its roots back to Malthus and Marx, you know that it's something that's hard to figure out. And I think the prospects for getting, you know, some sort of clear, definitive, conclusive agreement about that everybody, or sort of analysis that everybody believes is probably a bridge too far. But I'd like to suggest that there are different sort of dimensions that might be useful to be looking at, and I know that there certainly are policy researchers who are doing this, and some of the remaining foundations that are supporting it. So I just want to pose this and talk a little bit about the policy side too. So on the demographic variables to be thinking about. certainly fertility and the rate of population growth is one, but it's in many ways much more interesting to think about about undesired fertility, as earlier speakers were saying, and also, again, as was stated, how changes in age structure are so important. And the policy implication of that is really trying to understand which of the countries that currently have high fertility, persistent high fertility, have the potential to achieve relatively rapid decreases in population growth, along with the complementary kinds of policies that need to be in place to take advantage of the demographic bonus. It isn't all of the countries with relatively high fertility. A number of them have such poor governance environment, such poor institutional environments, that I think it's not very plausible to say that the demographic dividend or bonus is theirs for the capturing. But there are some where that's clearly a story that could be pursued. There's another demographic variable that's often not taken up, which is migration, both international, but perhaps more importantly for this conversation, internal migration, urbanization, and the impact on both the big mega cities and secondary cities. You know, if you project forward 10, 15 years, the people we care most about are not going to be in those remote villages, and actually now many of them aren't. They're in secondary cities whose infrastructure is completely overburdened by the rapid growth of population, both through natural and through migration, natural through fertility and through migration. So I think sort of broadening our perspective, I'm not telling you anything you don't already think about, but broadening the perspective and talking about those issues may have somewhat more traction than talking only about rapid population growth as a kind of aggregate phenomenon. Then in terms of outcome variables, there's a lot of work that's been done about changes in income poverty at the household level and this GDP question. And then USAID, I think, has been a pioneer in talking about and studying, providing the resources to study the impact of family planning and changes in fertility on major health outcomes. So that's clearly a kind of approach that has a lot of salience. There are others as well, I think, that haven't been studied as much but may be promising in the future. So these are harder concepts to measure than perhaps, infant and child mortality or some reproductive health outcomes. But concepts like happiness, which there's a growing kind of academic industry of trying to come up with metrics for happiness, often based on household surveys, asking people questions about dimensions of their lives and welfare. And there's a case being made that some kind of broader, more holistic concept of human welfare beyond GDP per capita is really much more meaningful. And so I think somehow connecting reproductive choice, family planning, to outcomes that include happiness would be something that could potentially, over the medium term, be very fruitful. Somewhat more near term is looking at issues of and talking about the impact on women's empowerment, on environmental impacts, as we heard earlier, on food security, on the savings rate, a very important question right now, and on social stability. I think that's going to be something that, as the current youth bulge hits a contracting economy, there's going to be a lot of discussion about what to do with the unemployed youth and the extent to which that causes social disruption. There may be a way to both use that for researchers to better understand that phenomenon, and also to use that in arguments for thinking about the future, the importance of reducing desired fertility. On the sort of policy variables, or sort of what to do, I think there's a good. The report does a very nice job of sort of sticking to the areas of demonstrable strength for USAID. I think at the same time it's useful, and I know folks in the POP office do this, to reach out to groups that focus on other things beyond increasing the access to family planning services and developing new and better contraceptive technologies. So those include things like policy measures to increase the access that women have to productive resources, reducing gender discrimination, gender-based violence, increasing demand and quality of education for girls. And hugely important is on the AIDS prevention front, both because there is potentially, I think to be fully demonstrated, but potentially some promise in integrating services, but also because the AIDS programs are eating everybody else's lunch. If you project forward, it doesn't take much imagination or arithmetic to see that the commitments that have been made around universal access to treatment, along with the really very limited success of prevention programs, lead to a conclusion that by 2016 or so, it's very plausible that AIDS programs, under that scenario, that AIDS programs will not just dominate the plausible envelope for official development assistance, but actually occupy almost all of it. So I think that there have been huge successes in the AIDS domain, not just raising resources, but actually the quality of the programs, the achievements, the results. But it's really the area of AIDS prevention that has fallen so far behind. And for everybody, whether you care mostly about AIDS or not, for everybody, it's incredibly important to support effective AIDS programs. So with those somewhat, hopefully not completely inchoate reflections, let me close with two recommendations. One is, and this is sort of about, areas to get more leadership around family planning and population issues. And one is a very obvious one, which is to look way past the G8. I mean, I think if there's one thing that we're seeing these days, it's that our notion of who's in charge of the world is being completely turned upside down. And, we have to figure out how to work with that. And so identifying leadership within the G20, whatever 20 that ends up being, is a tremendously important agenda for both substantive and I think tactical reasons. And I'm sure people have thought much more about that than I have. And the second on the leadership front is, if you want to change how open economists are at the World Bank to these concepts, then I think we need to think about the gender, age, national origin of the next president of the World Bank, and maybe whether or not she's a vegetarian. So with that, I will close and open it for Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth, and thanks to all the panelists. A lot of good stuff there. Gives us a lot of fodder for discussion. Can go in a lot of directions. As I mentioned up front, we're webcasting, and so we ask that you wait till a microphone comes to you to let us know who you are and pose your question, so the folks online can hear it as well. And we have some questions, in fact, from online, some people staying up or getting up awfully early on the other side of the globe to ask some questions and watch this webcast. But who would like to kick us off with a question for discussion this afternoon? All right, well, you guys think about it. I'm going to... Okay, I'm back.
Ron McGarrick with Japigo, and I'd really like to thank Duff and Joe and Steve and Margaret and
Liz.
Liz, a little mind block, for the really terrific report and your leadership in getting this out. My question is, I'm wondering what the reaction has been among the international community to the report, if from any of the international agencies, WHO, any foundations to the report, and if anyone may have come forth in terms of any commitment of additional dollars to family planning.
Well, the second question, part of your question, in terms of commitment, no, there hasn't been. Thoraya UNFPA was pleased with the report, and we've talked to her about how we can work together to advance some of the messages that UNFPA and we mutually support. It's also was well received by IPPF. I've had conversations with DFID and with some parliamentarians in the UK who also feel that it will be helpful and possible. Well, I'm going into all the details, but they see it as helpful. They don't see it as a something that is going to push things over the tipping point, as I don't think any document would do. As far as other donors, I know it's been circulated and maybe even read, but I haven't gotten any feedback. I don't know if Joe has gotten any or not. Have you?
We haven't gotten much feedback yet, but I think with all publications, its release is just the first step, and then it's up to all of us to make sure it gets to the attention of who needs to see it and act on it. So I think the follow-up is going to be as important as the document.
I actually neglected to say something. There will be a comment in the Lancet possibly this week, which goes beyond the report and talks about some of the things I talked about this morning, and gives a link to the report. And I think we can use that to perhaps open a door in somewhere, and that they'll have a. Hopefully, we can make that comment viral.
I've gotten some feedback from the European advocacy groups that Duff mentioned, that Joe helped to get organized back around the time of Cairo and just before, and it's been uniformly positive. And in fact, groups like DSW in Germany, World Population Foundation in the Netherlands, Équilibre Population in France have indicated a strong desire to use the report, translate it, and use it with their own governments. So in that sense, there has been some positive feedback. There's been no negative feedback that I've seen yet, and if any of you are aware of negative feedback, it would be interesting to hear that.
Okay. Yeah, Suzanne, you come over here.
Here it comes.
Hi, everyone. Suzanne Petroni with the Summit Foundation. Just in relation to that last question, you all just mentioned many of the northern donors. And one thing about the report and what you all presented today is that it's very unapologetic in linking investments in family planning with reduced fertility rates and reduced population growth rates, and the responsibility of the U.S. along those lines to help reduce the fertility rates and growth rates of developing countries. So I wonder, these are the same arguments that have led to some controversy in recent decades, led to some bristling on the part of developing countries of northern countries essentially suggesting how large or small their population sizes should be. So along the lines of your reactions from other countries, wonder if you have thoughts about how developing countries, feminists, human rights activists around the world might react to the report.
Obviously, Suzanne, that's an issue that we cared a lot about, and it's a question that Liz and Margaret kept very much in the forefront of our own discussions. One of the reasons I was at great pains in my oral presentation, looking right at you, to emphasize the importance of voluntarism in responding to unmet demand, and arguing that from a demographic standpoint was sufficient, was our sensitivity to any suggestion that the North should be telling the South how many children couples should be having or what their population growth rates should be. The fact of the matter is that while there has been in some African states a real resistance on the part of governments, and in many other countries a real resistance on the part of women's groups and human rights groups to a demographic message. The great majority of countries are willing to listen to evidence-based arguments that stay away from the issue of coercion or preaching about desired family size. And in my own conversations over the 4 years I was at IPPF with senior African statesmen, and I had many of them sort of across the whole continent, when we talked about responding to the expressed demand on the part of women in particular for access to the means to control their own fertility, the controversy really kind of disappears. If you put it in the context of a comprehensive set of policies that respond to women's health needs, to the educational needs of families, to economic security, then the demographic message is not automatically rejected. It's only rejected if it sounds like it's the only thing you're talking about. And so that's, I think, within the report, we tried very much to frame it in that context. If it comes across still as overbearing and demographic, that certainly wasn't intentional.
Okay, and a question over here, and then we'll move down.
Hi, my name is Junior Bridge, and I'm a federal contractor with USAID. My question to you, I'd like to commend all of you for this work. I think it's terrific. But it's terrific for those of us in the choir. Has there been any thought given, or is there any action underway to get all of the opinion leaders at the top levels together to see what the next step is? How do we reach out to the broader public who can also bring pressure to bear on policymakers to change the policy and the direction?
There's been a great deal of thought given to that. Less action than we would like to have at this point. Concerning the grassroots side of it, that's really not our shtick. We have no particular expertise in that area or resources. The grant we do have is actually pretty small. We're actually meeting tonight after this to discuss sort of the boots on the ground to get the message to key people on the Hill, and when the new team comes in to both state and USAID to get the message to them. So we're very aware that that's kind of a missing link. I would have thought that the grassroots thing was not as important as I thought, but having that example with the Gallup poll, perhaps I underestimated the need for that, even though that was a poorly worded question. Because in the past, after survey after survey after survey, this is actually not a controversial issue amongst most segments of the population in the United States. When you ask, should the United States support voluntary family planning programs as part of its foreign assistance program, going back as far as I can remember, maybe even as far as Joe can remember, which is maybe a month ago. No, I'm just kidding.
Yesterday.
It never has been a particularly controversial issue. That said, it's never been something that people think this is, as important as humanitarian relief after a tsunami either.
Duff, I don't think we ought to show that Gallup poll slide because I think the question was so egregiously miscast that there's no way you can characterize that 35% as an accurate reflection of the public response.
Except
if you wanted to use it for the point, to make the point that we've got work to do to reach public opinion, okay, but I just don't think that in any way reflects the way the American people really believe if the question had been properly phrased.
The point was that I was trying to make neither one of those points. The point I was trying to make, and not very well apparently, is that some of our champions on the Hill who know the wording of the global gag rule very well indeed were actually using that as a justification to avoid this issue of international family planning. So you had people who we depend upon, have depended upon, and will depend upon accepting a very faultily worded finding to basically say, just as, and this has already happened too, we can't afford it in these times of economic downturn. You got to remember that $1.2 billion, or $1 billion, if you go to $1 billion ask, is what? The bonus from a senior executive AIG? We are not talking about a large amount of money. Even if you talk about Joe's figures for the donors in general, it is not a large amount of money. And as Ruth has said, and we all have said, and we know what to do with the money. And that's the part that makes it, to me, very compelling, is that we actually do know what to do. And the demand is there.
And I'll just editorialize a bit as well. I think picking up on Ruth's point about also going the further step of the larger frame of what we're calling population and demographic issues, there's lots of interest among key elites in the government. So we have now the National Defense Strategy has population demographic factors as something that the U.S. government, across the government, needs to pay greater attention to. We have a group of West Point cadets, after all, taking a demography and security class and asking for materials from folks in the room here for how to teach this. So I think it's quite useful. Part of it is we do have to get out of our community and find these other communities that are coming to it from a different frame, with different ends, different means, but are trying to educate themselves about it. So I think part of it is there's a lot more interest perhaps than we may kind of initially perceive. There's a question down here, sir, and then in the back.
I'm Ray Martin, a former USAID population officer and colleague of all the presenters today. Now in my retirement, I'm director of a network of Christian agencies. It's called Christian Connections for International Health, and I mention that because it's pertinent to my question. I'm sort of wondering whether we have sufficiently researched this alleged opposition. I don't think Rick Warren is our enemy. I know Rick Warren. I don't think Rick Warren is our enemy. I don't think the 35% outcome of that Pew research says very much because of the wording of the question. When you tie abortion in some way with family planning, it completely swamps the reactions. And I'll mention that in relation to a study that our organization just did of our members on their activities and views on family planning. Our members are Christian organizations ranging from evangelical to mainline to Catholic, U.S., developing country, everything. What we found is that every one of these organizations support family planning, particularly if you make very clear that our definition of family planning does not include abortion. And when linked to maternal child health, meeting the MDGs and so forth, there's practically universal support, and half of our member organizations said that they would like to do more if they had the resources. So I think part of our challenge is framing our message so that it's clear what we are talking about and what we are not talking about, and somehow conveying to key decision makers that their perceived belief that family planning is toxic really isn't so. And I would suggest that in the picking up on what Joe said, that half the work remains, and the document producing the document is only half of it. I would suggest that there'd be a lot of serious effort made in identifying who this so-called enemy is, and then engaging them in dialogue, hopefully finding at least a degree of common ground that will change this perception of potential supporters on the Hill that family planning is something that you should drop very quickly because it's so toxic. I have copies of this report for anyone interested.
Terrific. Thanks. I think in the interest of time, perhaps we'll collect a few more and then give you guys a chance to respond. Go all the way in the back, and then we'll come back down.
Nancy Harris from JSI, and I'd like to join the others in complimenting you on a wonderful report. Very important, and as with probably most people in this room and on the webcast, I pray that we really do get more money for family planning. But I'm asking the question on behalf of the choir here. If we do, I think on the balance we're ready to spend this. We know what to do in general. But I'd like to ask the panelists who are practitioners, and I'm a practitioner in the field, how can we prepare to really spend this money? Sterilization programs have become sort of not as dynamic as they once were, even in Africa or in other places. A lot of the human resources have gone to the AIDS movement. You alluded to some issues with UNFPA. I don't think we need to elaborate. How can we be prepared to really effectively spend this money? Because I'm not convinced that we're quite ready. I think there's a lot of prep work that has to be done by the health professionals to get ready to really use this money efficiently and effectively.
Okay, thanks. So how do we spend the money? If we go right down here. She's coming from the other direction. Will's getting there.
Thank you. My name is Sheila McDonald. I'm from Population Strategies Group. And there's a great report and very good presentations. And I want to take off from this gentleman who's talking about some of the religious groups. I've been a lobbyist for 40 years in Washington, starting in agriculture and food and going off into budget and Medicare and macro issues. And this is my question to you. If you look back at successful groups that had issues that were very touchy, like civil rights, it wasn't until all the organizations got together that you got the civil rights bills passed. You had this group that wanted to end landmines, and it wasn't until they got a central group together to build grassroots that they ended landmines. And the group I was working with, which I think it was 12 years I worked with it, was to get mental health coverage and health insurance, and they got all the groups together. They met here in town. I have tried, since I don't work full-time anymore, to work with population and environmental groups to get them to work on the very issues in the way you're talking about it, and this gentleman has mentioned, to band together and form a grassroots network that starts talking with the messages that are appropriate. I can't tell you, but I can hear you talking about them. Why isn't that being done? I have proposed it to numbers of groups with my business partner, and who's a demographer, PhD, and I'm a lobbyist, not a PhD, but why isn't this being done? Why don't the environmentalists start and the religious groups and this kind of group, delivery system groups, get together?
Okay. Terrific. Okay, well, why don't we've come to the end of the program, but why don't we give you folks a chance to respond to those questions and any other reflections you may have.
I'll go very quickly because I'm sure my colleagues would have something to add. Well, it's Ray. It's difficult to answer your question because I think it's very nuanced and complex. But if you read the comments of the Republican leadership on the stimulus package component with family planning, I don't know if that's their true belief or not, but it certainly was indicative of people who do not consider family planning as anything appropriate for poor women who want to have family planning in the United States. And I think there's other examples like that too. So I don't know who the enemy is, but I can assure you that there are large segments of the population, not a majority, who oppose this. I'd choose not to look at them as an enemy, but as a reality that has to be dealt with. And when dialogue is possible, yes, we should do that. And hopefully we can find common grounds. Nancy, your comments are very important. I actually meant to say something about that during my presentation. We were very concerned about the absorption issue. If the leadership of the agency and the leadership of state say this is important, it will be done. And I think done fairly fast. And if you look at the HIV/AIDS program, the malaria program, the TB program, yeah, there's some bumps and things, but it's actually relatively easy. One of the reasons for that, and there's implications for this in the long term, is the important role that NGOs play, international NGOs and indigenous NGOs, as a mechanism for getting services out there. And as you know, probably better than many people in this room, there is not limitless, but there is an ability to expand services relatively quickly. In terms of the human resources, I know, because a lot of them come to me for help getting jobs, that there is a cadre of people in the United States and elsewhere who are well trained and would very much like to go into this area. So I think that if there's an increase in money, you would see an infusion of new people. Maybe even a few who have gone on the other side to HIV/AIDS coming back. In terms of Sheila's comments, yeah, I totally agree with you. And there's actually people in this room who've been trying to do that, and I'll let them over the reception talk to you about that. It's much more difficult, but I agree that if you could bring a united front, if you will, that it could make all the difference in the world, and that doesn't exist now. I would agree with you.
Let me just add a couple of thoughts to what Duff says, with all of which I agree. First, Nancy, on the point about how long it would take for groups to respond to a significant increase in the availability of money, I think Duff is absolutely right. particularly inasmuch as many of the groups that have gone to do other things as a consequence of shifts in budgets haven't forgotten how to do family planning if the funds come back and if the priority returns. I sense, by the way, from conversations that I have with other donors, that there is a broad agreement that we really kind of got it wrong after Cairo in de-emphasizing family planning. And the word family planning was for a decade after Cairo unmentionable in Europe. That's no longer true. The Europeans are talking about family planning. They're talking about family planning really as the forgotten component of the Cairo agenda and about the importance of bringing it back. So that I think if the United States fulfills Duff's fantasy of a joint statement by Bill Gates and Hillary Clinton that the United States is back as a major supporter of family planning as part of a comprehensive response to the reproductive health needs around the world, there will be lots of people who will happily join us in that crusade. On the issue of particularly the environmental population coalition and the importance of finding a way to bring these groups together, it's very much related to Ray's comment and to the religious issue as well. I mean, I think, Ray, you're absolutely right that the vast majority of religious groups in the United States, and you know this far better than I from your own research and your work, are very much on the same message as we are when we talk about voluntary family planning and its benefits for families and so on. But the other side, and there is another side, has been extraordinarily clever and effective in driving a wedge right through the heart of that religious consensus by cynically associated support for family planning with abortion advocacy in the United States, to the point that it has become Republican orthodoxy. And when it's Republican orthodoxy, it means at least 45% of the people in this country who vote Republican sort of have bought into that. So we can't dismiss this as as a minority view, even though I think in terms of religious belief, it is. And there's a huge job to be done, I think, to try to discuss with the Republican leadership in the United States how misled they have been in their efforts to create a religious coalition in support of the Republican Party. And to persuade them that their future lies in associating with that other 90% of religious Americans who actually believe in family planning and support the kinds of things we're talking about. I think that's got to be the strategy. And I think if we do that and succeed in detoxifying the issue, it will not be hard to get that coalition with the environmentalists. But frankly, the environmental groups remain very wary of working with population groups as long as we are the enemy of the Republicans. They don't want to be on the wrong side of the Republicans on this issue. They want a broad bipartisan coalition in support of environmental work.
A couple of quick comments. I think it's true that aid is not likely to be deeply involved in abortion, so supporting aid should not be controversial. On the other hand, I think we have to recognize that access to abortion is critical for women to exercise their reproductive rights. And we can't ignore that. 42 million abortions every year in the world is something that's absolutely crucial to be made safe and should be made available. Aid probably won't be the group that's doing that, unfortunately, as long as the Helms Amendment is in place. With regard to environmental groups, a few years ago when I was at the Hewlett Foundation, we worked with Summit and Rockefeller to try to analyze why don't environmental organizations really get more deeply involved. And in addition to the issue that Steve mentioned, which is basically their fear of controversy, there was also a sense that they didn't really have moral standing because the North is the major consumer and the major polluter and the major problem in terms of the environment. I think that was a somewhat short-sighted kind of approach, and maybe the fact that China is now the #1 consumer of everything you can name except petroleum products will change a few minds. And as E.O. Wilson said, the rising standard of living, which we hope occurs, is the aftershock of the population bomb that's going to be as important as the population bomb itself, unless we change the way our economies work.
Wow, terrific. We've gone a bit over, but I think it was well worth it to have the chance for the rich presentations and comment, and also because we can now adjourn and continue the conversation for reception. Please join me in thanking our 4 panelists for today's discussion.